So here's the agenda for today's presentation. It's going to be roughly split into two 15-minute segments. I'm going to introduce myself and my work at the CSU. We'll talk about uh, that data landscape at the California State University and how that presents some challenges in reporting. And then I'll end with some examples that QuickSite helps us with. Um, and I like to be a little open-ended, so if there are any questions, I'll do my best to monitor the chat and answer them as they come up. But of course, like Madison said, there's going to be room in the end for questions and specific things. So just with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm Berto Tubenuti. I'm the manager of data analytics at the Business Intelligence Data Operations group at the California State University Office of the Chancellor. Whoa, that's a long title. Um, and so we deal with data for uh, 23 campuses, uh, and this makes us the largest public university system in the United States. Um, I've been at the CSU for 5 years, and I've spent 14 years in the data analytics realm, and I'm almost at my 20 years in higher education. Get rid of that asterisk soon enough. Uh, and what I love about working in the CSU is the depth and breadth of the data and the systems that we're dealing with. Um, for example, if you've ever been to the DMV in California, you might be familiar with their, or Costco for if you're not in California, you might see a green screen whenever they're processing uh, any information, and that's a mainframe-based system out of IBM. And we're using a similar system for our payroll system. So that's dating back almost 50 years. Similarly, we're using PeopleSoft environments for our student HR and finance data. And so those are very different systems with very different evolutionary tracks. Um, and of course, now we have our data lake and the AWS resources tied to that data lake. And so we have 50 years worth of data frameworks just right there that we have to contend with on a production basis. And of course, we have dozens, if not hundreds, of ad hoc campus data sources, ad hoc chancellor's office data sources, and individual user data sources that are all, as complex as data lake integrations and as simple as as a VLOOKUP enabled table in Excel. And so all of those are, believe it or not, supporting production workflows. And so what does that mean in terms of our analytic frameworks or how things are reported? Well, we have to support 50 years worth of reporting frameworks. So from green bar paper. So for those that don't know what that is, that's back when crosstabs couldn't be really presented on a computer screen. You would print everything out in green bar, which basically is where banding came from in your Excel or Tableau or QuickSite dashboard. And then you would put them all in binders. And then we go from that all the way to tools that have artificial intelligence or agents built in, and everything in between. Again, going from Excel to QuickSite to OBIEE to PeopleSoft reports and analytics and everything in between. I like to joke that there's no contract we don't like at the CSU. And so, how is this challenging? What about having 50 years worth of frameworks uh, create for us in the data realm? And so I think the number one thing we've been running into at a system-wide scale has been defining what authoritative is. So when things have worked very independently in a very decentralized way um, in our system, because that's sort of how these campuses came together. It was all very decentralized. Um, the campuses and the systems around those campuses evolved independently, and you have different terminology. So, for example, something like full-time equivalent student or full-time equivalent faculty that is defined differently um, at the finance level, at the HR level, and at the student level. And so now that we're increasingly in this consolidated space by way of our data lake infrastructure defining what's authoritative turns into this large conversation, if not flame war, um, where people are, no, it's my system that's the system of record. And I think, one of the jobs of someone in my role is to remind them that it's like, no, it's systems of record that we have to keep track of and agree on and uh, figure things out with. Concurrent to that is a multitude of legacy processes that we have to support. I kept alluding to 50 years worth of frameworks and systems that are deployed in production environments. And so those all require interaction and contract renewals and all kinds of glue to keep them going. And in addition to that, you have all of these uh, problems when you're trying to integrate these different systems that don't necessarily or were never intended to talk to each other. And I think these two first items lead to what I like to call an army of human joins. And so what does that mean? It means a bunch of people downloading data from one system, downloading data from another system, and combining it together in Excel or doing uh, data entry tasks, things that, in a modern environment could be automations, could be joins, could be just complex logic that's done programmatically. But right now we're dealing with multiple people, multiple departments doing this all manually. And again, I think this is a very you might see this in different levels at your institutions or your areas of work, but it's a huge problem for a system as large as the California State University, where we're dealing with 60,000 employees and almost 500,000 students, and all of the data that's generated therein. And then finally, uh, we have compliance to worry about. And so there's local, state, and federal bodies that don't care about any of our problems, and they just want us to give them reports and address some of the issues that they want addressed without taking into consideration if it's feasible, if we have the data. They want it yesterday. And so I think this leads to working at the CSU feeling like you're in a 1700s naval battle a lot of the time. Um, it can be very contentious, it can be very painful, but this is precisely why I like working with QuickSite. Um, QuickSite is a tool that gives us access to all our data, to our data lake in all its glory. It gives us the ability to develop very quickly, and I think the most important part, because we have, like I said, 60,000 employees, 500,000 students. Um, it allows us to scale quickly. So once a dashboard is developed, we can share it across the system without having to replicate it 23 times. I have a very small team. Um, and even with around 20 people working with me, I don't manage all of those 20 people, but that's the type of team that is working on this information. We're able to deploy a lot very quickly. And QuickSite is a cornerstone to that. And so, of course, there are other solutions. And so, I'd like to have a clumsy metaphor for this. And so, QuickSite, that's our star here. Like Magic Johnson in the 80s, QuickSite is adaptable to many roles. It may not be the best at a specific role, but it could do it all. And that elevates our whole team by giving us speed and agility to get things done. Now, you could have winning teams with other combinations. It just doesn't necessarily work with us. So, for example, um, Power BI might be built like a tank, but it's also highly dependent on the right stack, like Shaq was on the 2000s Lakers. And it's also not the most nimble, and it can't shoot free throws. Tableau, there's immediate wow factor, and that's something that it's really hard for us uh, to deal with sometimes when we're dealing with users coming from Tableau. But it's also a highly specialized tool, and it's kind of a heavy lift for the team. I see Naman raise their hand. My bad. Okay, sorry. I was like, man, did I insult someone? I was worried this was going to be my most controversial slide. But I talk about elevating the whole team, and I think the team, in addition to the people working on the dashboards directly, so I'm predominantly in charge of a front end development team. Um, well, at least it's not Chime, Lamont. Uh, So the team that we're working with and that QuickSite helps elevate is the front end team, which is what I work with, but we also have the infrastructure and data lake team. So you have engineers, architects, and DevOps that work together to make sure that data is accessible and available for everyone on a daily basis. It's really the infrastructure, the plumbing behind the scenes that people most of the time ignore, but will complain if it ever breaks. And then you have the subject matter experts. And so these are specialized teams that deal with finance or HR or student reporting and information, and they help us define and deliver the dashboard solutions that we're working on at a system-wide scale. And of course, our largest group is going to be the end users. And so we have hundreds of front-end consumers of these dashboards that, will ring the alarm anytime something goes wrong or anytime there's an ambiguity in our dashboards and we have to clear it up. And so as much as I would like for my team to take credit for everything, um, this is an ecosystem-based situation, and it's hundreds of people working on this together. Now, I we don't have enough time to go really deep into some dashboards that my team or folks that have been influenced by my team have developed. So I'm going to very, very, very quickly click on this link. This is open to the public, so you should be able to interact and access this. And let me copy this link. And hold on, let me copy it from here just to make sure we're grabbing the public link. Alrighty then, there's the link. So if you want to follow along, you can look at our production environment and this financial transparency dashboard that someone in our team named Josh James put together. And so this details the financial health and operations of the CSU at a very, very high level. And as you click through these links, you can kind of see all of the different visual and summarizing capabilities of QuickSite and some of the items that we'll talk about. Now, a little bit of context about this. We had a contract that had to get renewed every year. We were able to transition this to QuickSite in a couple of months. It was actually a very quick development cycle and got rid of that contract. And so, this is one way the CSU saved a lot of money by just leveraging our QuickSite abilities and the fact that all of that information was already on the data lake. And it's a lot more maintainable and could be more real time as we evolve our processes. And of course, in typical dashboard fashion, when you refresh the data, all of the visuals reflect that. You might have to make a few tweaks here and there in terms of filters and whatnot, but generally you build it once and it's there, and so that also cuts down on the development lift. It's such an ambitious topic. Um, Developing in the highest public in the largest public education system in the nation. Um, it's a lot, and like we have about 15 minutes left. So what can I give you from a development standpoint? And so I'm going to give you three high-level pieces of advice that are hopefully useful. Hopefully, it's not too basic review, but given the format, this is I think the best I could do. And so the three areas of advice I'm going to be talking about have to do with metadata, with parameter controls, and with defaults, templates, and styles. Um, so let's start off with metadata and introductions. And so this is, your typical intro page to a dashboard. I mean, as much as I'd love to just build a dashboard and tell my users here, figure it out, it's not something we can really do, right? And so typically you create an introductory page, and QuickSite has a nice plain text editor that allows, or not plain text, but rich text editor that allows you to create a lot of this and paste it in. Typically, we just we write it up in a word processor and then just paste it into the intro page. But that's very manual, right? That's hands-on, and so why do that if you could do some automation? And so one of the things I've been doing is, hey, your metadata is data, so why not embed a table that has all of your sources and column definitions um, as a table in your introduction page. And that way, when your data changes, you just update your table and you have a nice, neat table embedded in your dashboard. And then I see a question. Do you use QuickSite Q with QuickSite dashboards? I with financial transparency. So these those public items we haven't deployed the Q or the AI capabilities yet. It's something that we're investigating, and I think there may be more later this year in terms of that, but I think that's just something that we're working on. But I think I can answer that with a little bit more elaboration at the end of the conversation. So here's another metadata table that I have embedded into our visual. And so again, this is not just the column descriptions, but this is a description of the joins and what the table exactly is doing. And so this is still relatively manual, but I have a proposed workflow that might take advantage of some of our more. So actually, it's very great that you brought up Q because this is actually bringing up that agentic nature. Um, so all of this information in QuickSight is exposable as an object via the command line. Um, and so with some basic scripting, you could take those JSON definitions and turn your dashboards or your data sets into custom data sets. Um, and if you run that through a simple RAG, retrieval augmented generation, I believe that's what that stands for, or a knowledge base, you can maybe have self-documenting dashboards. And so this is something that we're experimenting with um, and trying to automate so that whenever we create a dashboard, then everything is defined using a knowledge base that we curate. And there may be some things in QuickSight that that might help you with this. Um, it's not just limited to Q, but again, that's something that we can discuss later. So that's metadata. Now let's talk about parameter controls. And so our data lake, so again, uh, I will try to answer this in 15 seconds. And so it is S3 to Athena, and then we have some additional ETL and transformations using Databricks and Snowflake. So it's a hybrid data lake, but the the core of it is DMS and S3. And then we just propagate from there. This could get way more complicated than that, but I think that's as high level as I can give you. Um, so let's talk about parameter controls. No, parameter controls are not filters that require more clicks. I think this is sort of my first impression of parameter controls before I kind of figure out the magic they offer. Um, and so parameter controls are very cool. So, something very simple that you could do with a parameter control is use it as a dimension and then have your dimension change on the fly. And so here we've applied it in a pivot table. We've created two uh, uh, columns that are parameter controlled. And so you can cross a table that you're working with a zillion different ways, or 7 times 7 minus the duplications. Somebody do the math for me there. And this allows you to really take advantage of real estate, have one 1280 by 640 block of dashboard represent what could be dozens of pages. And so rather than having a zillion tabs, if you use your parameter controls intelligently, you could do it all in one screen. But you might all be very familiar with this, so maybe this isn't so exciting. So let's talk about something else you could do with parameter controls. So you could do some pretty fancy filtering with parameter controls. And so again, going back to my introduction slide for parameters, but aren't parameters better than filters? And yes, parameters are referenced across sheets. There's some setup involved to make them referenced across multiple sheets. The scope of the filter or of the parameter has to be set. But again, this is a high level cover. So, that's going to take me a while to explain. So I'm just going to focus on what I'm trying to talk about here in terms of the filter. But I think one of the ways where a parameter-based filter really outshines just a straightforward filter um, is, so for example, if you have hundreds of cases that you want to filter on, if you were to do a multi-select, that puts a lot of work on the user, right? And so with a parameter control, you could create buckets and then use a filter to select a bucket of 20 things in a 300 dimension or case dimension that you're trying to filter. You could also do things that overlap. So that's something that's not possible with normal filters. If you have cases where you want to select same populations in multiple filter options for whatever reason, you can do that with parameter controls. And then one of the cooler things that I learned about recently is doing dynamic defaults on a user level at the point of interaction with the dashboard. So many of you are familiar with row level security. So you set up a data set that's associated with a particular dashboard. You enable row level security, and then based on the rules of the row level security, the user interacting with the dashboard is only going to see certain things. This is very similar, but instead of being tied to row level security, it's tied to a default parameter filtering. And so you can have a single dashboard that dynamically changes um, its filter values based on who the person is. And so again, this gives you that ability to scale. You build a single dashboard, you have different views based on that parameter, you tie them to a user, and that sets your default values for how that displays. The user can override this, but the default values are there, and you can control them in a single place. And so, rather than having 100 dashboards, you can have one with a very complex set of parameter controls tied to the user. And so, last thing about parameter controls. So, you can use parameters as labels. So again, this might be, 101. This might be very basic, but you could take a parameter control and you have it be the name for an axis or a column, really any dimension that you can control in your visuals. You'll see that little uh, uh, equalizer looking button that's for parameters, and so you can input not just one parameter but multiple parameters into your axis. And so here you have, like, I have a measure and an axis label that's being used as a y-axis identifier. The other thing you could do, taking advantage of the fact that the parameter could be applied globally, is have single value parameters for your values and just use parameters as a matter of practice for all your values. Why do this? It's extra steps. Well, if you're constantly drafting dashboards and you have those different values used in a bunch of different dashboards or visuals, um, having a single value parameter allows you to globally change those names without having to individually click on the values or on the visuals and then do it manually. You could just set everything to a parameter, and then once the committee you're working with decides that no, this is going to be called FTEF, not full-time equivalent faculty, then you just change it at the parameter level, and uh, you don't have to click a zillion times. And so this takes some setup, but I use parameters everywhere just because it saves me so much effort, once you go past that barrier for entry. So enough about parameters. I'm almost at the end of this, I promise. Um, Again, this is very 101, but you probably have a communications team, or at least a logo, that you can pull some colors and fonts from. And so make sure to take advantage of theming, templating, and defaults to make your life easier. And so QuickSite gives you some starter themes if you don't have your own theme, but you can also create your custom one. So like you see here, we have a CSU default that's based on the color palette that our communications team put together. And again, that makes everything more consistent, and uh, it's a more cohesive user experience. You could also do this down to the uh, environment level, so you can customize your branding at that level too. It doesn't just have to be, say, QuickSite. But again, this is pretty high level, pretty basic. Uh, Something that's a little bit more granular would be if you're going to change your formats, for example, don't do it at the visual level, do it at the data set level. Because if you do it at the visual level, you're going to have to customize your format. So for example, if you have percentage, you have to change it to a percentage for every visual you create that has that value. Whereas if you do it at the data set level, you only have to do it once and then you just, keep it the same as necessary. Again, this is all very basic stuff, but it's worth mentioning. Um, and then finally, take advantage of duplicating visuals. Um, I'm hoping you're not generating a new visual every time you need to start. I'm hoping you're leveraging the fact that you could duplicate visuals um, and uh, and then just start with a template that you've already set. And then finally, take advantage of free-form visuals. Now, this is something that I complained about initially when I was using uh, the other visual default because I couldn't see how wide something was and couldn't control exactly size and position. But if you go to freeform, you could control the size and position to the pixel. And it allows you overlapping and all kinds of things. So I see the chat blew up a little bit. Let me make sure I don't have any questions that I missed. Do you like the data in a single source per dashboard, or are you happy to join within QuickSite? And then are we able to create parameter control for dates in which we select the date from a calendar like we do in a filter instead of a drop-down style for cases in which we need 2 years worth of days? And then changing the data set level will be so helpful. Thanks for that tip. Okay, so thank you, Katie. That's the easiest one to answer. Yeah, happy to give you the tip. And from Veronica, the parameter control dates, yes, you can. If you set a parameter type to date, it's smart enough to be able to give you the little calendar, and so you can have a start date and an end date. So play around with the parameter and set the default to date. Um, Now you could also cast your variable to a string, and then put in and then use a string variable for a date. If that way, if you want to sort by a specific date, it makes it easier and you don't have to deal with the calendar. So you could have your cake and eat it. And then finally, do you like data in a single source per dashboard, or are you happy to join within QuickSight? I'm using the SQL query part of QuickSight all the time, so I do the joins within the SQL. I do join with the GUI from time to time, especially when we're crossing data sources, because that way you're unable to use the SQL part. But typically I'm using a lot of Athena sources, and so I could just use the native SQL to do that part. And so I think I answered all the questions right now. Again, we'll open it for more questions towards the end. Um, and then I think the very last part, and this is something that really easily becomes a problem once you start building dashboards, is that the naming conventions matter. Especially since QuickSight will alphabetically sort your data fields, and so it kind of discombobulates you to begin with. And so why not take advantage of that though? And so for example, whenever I create custom fields like filters, I do dash F because that way it makes them go to the very top, and then all the filters are lumped together. I'm less when it comes to custom fields, I sometimes just name them whatever I want them to show, like in a dashboard, because I'm lazy. But sometimes if I'm being responsible, I'll also do that dash. And then similarly, I use camel case starting with a P for parameters, just to be able to remember what those are. Because if you have something that's very similarly named, you could get very confused, and it gets complicated when you're doing uh, more complex custom fields.